Western Sydney University Library will record this Zoom webinar for publishing on its website. Participation in the chat and/or question and answer sections of the Zoom webinar is completely optional. By participating in the chat, you consent to the information shared in these sections being collected and used by Western Sydney University for learning purposes and to build a catalogue of thought leadership event videos. Any personal information collected by Western Sydney University during the Zoom webinar will be handled in accordance with its privacy policy and privacy management plan, which can be accessed online. With respect for Aboriginal cultural protocols, Western Sydney University Library acknowledges the traditional custodians of the unceded lands and waterways on which our libraries are located and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. The university works across many different lands, and we are currently on the lands of the Burramatagal people of the Darug Nation. We celebrate the knowledge and living cultures of Indigenous Australians and acknowledge their important contribution to teaching, learning and research. We acknowledge that the activities currently delivered across our campuses are a continuation of teaching and learning that has occurred on these lands for tens of thousands of years. We also pay our respect to any First Nations people in the meeting. In this spirit, we welcome any guests to the meeting. Western Sydney University was placed first in the world in the 2022 and 2023 Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, the only global performance measure that assesses universities against United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This event series aims to celebrate and promote this #1 ranking, complementing work being undertaken across the university as part of its Sustainability and Resilience Decadal Strategy 2030. I'll just pass over to my colleague Bandra Chandran to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Stephen Healy, a valued member of the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University. Associate Professor Healy's research has delved into a variety of topics such as healthcare reform policy, cooperative and regional development, and solidarity economy movement. Throughout these investigations, his core interest has revolved around understanding the desires, fantasies, and anxieties that shape the human subject. Associate Professor Healy will present the findings of the Australian Research Council Discovery Project titled Innovative Waste Economies, Redrawing the Circular Economy. This research revolves around the global waste crisis and the concept of the circular economy, a solution that seeks to replace our current take-make-waste economy with a more sustainable and efficient system that reduces waste and recovers value from discarded materials. Today's presentation will center on one experiment of many already underway in Australia, a collaborative effort to transport organic waste, specifically spent coffee grounds, from Sydney city cafes, businesses, and universities to peri-urban farms practicing regenerative farming. Associate Professor Healy's current ARC project, investigating innovative waste economies, redrawing the circular economy, aligns with his previous research, reconfiguring the enterprise, shifting manufacturing culture in Australia. Associate Professor Healy's work has been published in numerous respected journals, and he is a founding member of the Community Economies Research Network. As we delve into the presentation today, let us reflect on the future he proposes, one that requires not only technical improvement in waste management, but a reconfiguration of our social practices, economic relationships, and ingrained habits. Please join me in warmly welcoming Associate Professor Stephen Healy for our Thought Leadership Event Series number 11. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much for attending both in person and virtually to this latest edition of the Thought Leadership Series. And I would particularly like to thank Emma Boddington and Bada Chandran for both their patience with me and in their efforts at organizing this series. I thought I would say a little bit more about leadership. The leadership that's being showcased in this series is not just the success of individual scholars or research projects, but how this young institution has now been ranked twice as the #1 in the world in the Times Higher Education in relation to Sustainable Development Goals. So how did this happen? Last week, I was at a conference at one of the group of 8 institutions focused on climate change. 2 in attendance were erstwhile colleagues of ours at Western, and both of them expressed their fondness for Western Sydney University and their admiration for its commitment to the region. In my view, there's a close connection between serving the interests of Australia's fastest growing region that is also on the front lines of the consequences of climate change. Although in light of the news from the Northern Hemisphere at the moment, one might say the front line is now everywhere. Engaging here, I think, means continuing to make this place livable in ways that benefits the entire nation and by extension, other parts of the planet that are struggling with these same issues, how to live in a much warmer planet and restive 21st century. And I'm thinking here as well of previous lectures by Louise Crabtree-Hayes, Jessica Weir, Sebastian Fausch, and committed professional staff like Roger Atwater, among others. All of their work is engaged with this place, with its challenges and possibilities, and with exercising responsibility and care through engagement. The particular project I'm going to talk about today, as was just mentioned, critically engages with the concept of the circular economy. And as such, it touches on issues of food security, responsible production and consumption, energy security, and climate action. So that's 4 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So really, it probably touches on a lot more than that. What's remarkable is that this link between regional commitment, engaged research, and the SDGs is to be found across many research efforts here at the university. So I don't think it's an accident that we're #1. And I wanted to say a little bit more about care for country or the acknowledgement practice. I've been in country for 9 years now. And for me, when I first came to this country, this was the first time I heard this cultural protocol of acknowledgement. And as a foreigner, it's deeply moving for me. I remember one welcome to country that I attended at an event organized by Landcom. And the gentleman who gave it was a 96-year-old Aboriginal man who was part of the stolen generation. And so he didn't know what country he came from, but he grew up in Mount Druitt. And what he said to me and to many other people, most of whom were from somewhere else in the world, is he said, doesn't matter where you've come from, you're here now, and you're invited to care for country. So when I think about responsibility, engagement, a commitment to the region, and the SDG goals, there's an alignment there. There's a continuity. There's a kind of partial attempt at reparations for being, in my case, an uninvited guest in this country. And I'm really grateful to be a part of this institution. Okay, so the story I want to focus on today is one part of a larger project that aims at rethinking, or more precisely, redrawing the circular economy, which we might initially think of as a sustainable alternative to the take, make, waste of business as usual. The particular focus of my work with colleague Abimelech Lopez is a redrawing of the circle in relation to organic waste. Our efforts are taking place in the midst of a world in which policies, practices, and infrastructures are arranged to ensure the forward supply chain is working smoothly, getting food from peri-urban producers to urban consumers in places like Sydney as quickly as possible in a linear fashion. The proposition that this paper explores is the design of a reverse logistics, the circular process of moving organic waste from urban sites and spaces back onto farms. We understand the design of this reverse logistics supply chain as an instance of what we might call, following Gibbs and Graham, a diverse economization, a making of the economy that's also a process of social and ecological reinvention. Rather than a circle, the image that surfaces here is Karen Berard and Gahn's diagram of the infinite plurality of the virtual, not one circle, but many circles, along with eddies, currents, and back channels. This is one of the reasons why my colleague, Ruth Lane, thinks that a better image than the circle might be the process of churn, sort of a remixing of economies in the process of making new connections and acting in more responsible ways towards the waste that's the inevitable part of living on this planet. So the larger context for our reflections is a 3-year project funded by the Australian Research Council entitled Investigating Innovative Waste Economies, Redrawing the Circular Economy. The project brings together insights from diverse economies, discard studies and design, in a case-based, empirically driven approach that aims to identify socially innovative waste economies in Australia. Against a backdrop of the crisis touched off by China's withdrawal as the global recycler in 2018 and the link between various forms of wasting and the climate emergency, there's an urgent need to reconfigure our relationship with waste, but also with one another. The dominant policy response in Australia has been the hasty embrace of circular economy policy with a speed that is at once promising, but also disconcerting, because there's always the possibility that these good ideas can be corralled into the reproduction of business as usual. So against this backdrop of crisis, ecological calamity, and fast policy, our aim, following Morris, is to connect with already existing experiments that aim to reinvent relationships with waste to see what we can learn. Following diverse economies scholars J.K. Gibson Graham and Ethan Miller, we think with the world, with the fullness of our interdependencies in an effort to renegotiate terms with it. This process may be understood as a form of what Kalan and Klaskin describe as economization, the making of markets, the process of pacification, valuing, pricing, and the stabilization of relationships that facilitate exchange. But from our perspective, it's also more than that. This process of marketization can turn waste into a feedstock or organize for its disappearance. And this is what the stylized, famous butterfly diagram from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation proposes. But the risk that we see in this sometimes narrow framing of the circular economy is that it's a primarily technical exercise in market making. Indeed, powerful actors already prefigure circularity as an exercise in transforming waste into opportunity, read New South Wales circular economy policy, or asset mapping, the way that Sydney Water, for example, thinks about it. And here, what counts as circular is the repurposing of waste material as an input for business as usual. We might go further following scholars like Josh Reno and Kirsty Hobson in seeing in this model not only a perfectionism that is unrealistic, but really the expectation that circularity and economic growth can go hand in glove, the fantasy that we can be, as Kirsty Riley observes, both rich and green, right? So no choice, no loss. Ironically, the problem here is that such a fantasy can only be sustained by a limited conception of what circularity is and who's involved. Such a limited conception of economy, circular or otherwise, blinds us to broader and more inclusive possibilities. The role that a diverse array of actors, institutions, and relationships may play in squaring the circle. We need to make room in this circle for the giving and receiving of gifts, the goodwill of institutions, the normative commitments of cooperative and social enterprises in our efforts to understand circularity, for indeed, these things are already at work, remaking our relationship with waste. To ignore or marginalize this diversity is, in our view, to follow on in the mode of stupidity. Gibson, Graham, and Miller quoting here Isabella Stengers. In our view, breaking from this stupidity involves us in a parallel process of reinventing our social relationships with one another as we rework our relationship with wasted things. How then do we break from this mode of stupidity? One place to start is with a much fuller understanding of economy. And here's where diverse economies comes in. So the evolving diverse economies framework and scholarship provides us with one way of making sense of this fuller picture. The initial move is to reconceptualize economy outside of what Gibson Graham termed a capitalocentric framing, which privileges private enterprise employing wage labor to produce goods and services for sale in a market, the tip of the iceberg in this diverse economy diagram. In place of this is the simple suggestion that economies are already always more than capitalist, that they involve an array of transactional relations, enterprise and site organization, kinds of labor, forms and forms of property and finance, and further that most of these are non-capitalist in their structure. This reframing of economy provides a conceptual space for thinking about the already recognized role that informal, non-market, and non-capitalist enterprises play in waste economies. This is particularly evident in majority world contexts. It's also a framework for thinking with others about how things might be reconfigured. And that brings us to the second way that we've done this work of thinking with others and the world, using workshops as a form of engaged research. In the context of our research, we've identified an array of actors who could be enrolled in getting organic waste, particularly spent coffee grounds, from central business district cafes and roasters and onto farms in the peri-urban region. We convened a design workshop in December of last year to help design a reverse logistics supply chain with organics. These actors included organic farmers and vermiculturalists, 3 large-scale coffee roasters, names you would all recognize, the University of Technology Sydney, local council representatives, City of Sydney officials, and representatives from a social enterprise, Mates on the Move, that uses waste hauling as a context for giving economic opportunities and training for ex-offenders. The key figure in this workshop, however, was Michelle Zybots, a transport planner by day, but also an organic farmer and proprietor of the Hartley Vale Good Garlic Company, a 12-hectare farm located 150 kilometers west of Sydney's central business district. With the help of family members and friends, Michelle has been collecting over the last several years output from the food waste dehydrator at UTS and hauling it westward onto her farm. She's discovered a plethora of benefits for regenerating soil quality from her experiments with windrow composting on her land, again, principally spent coffee grounds. She's observed that these mounds rich with coffee grounds early in their process of decomposition repel rodents, and witnessed the sort of great mouse outbreak of, 2021, 2022, not a problem for her. And then as these piles decay a little bit further, they end up attracting earthworms in the millions. And she ground truthed that for me by overturning some of this compost. It was incredible. The warmth also attracts black snakes, but fortunately not in the millions. So all of these animal laborers, microbes and earthworms and so forth do their work. And as they eat this compost, they change its tilth, resulting in soil that is more capable of holding water. This is that is of great value to farmers when water is scarce, what we're anticipating with the next 5 years of the El Nino vacillation. And it's of great benefit to the communities in times like the last 3 years when we've been deluged with unending rain, right? So farms like this that practice regenerative farming can be part of a municipal strategy for water containment and control. So before the workshop, we asked Michelle to draw her existing economy, a state A of her relations at the farms, the set of relationships with suppliers, haulers, and downstream consumers that comprised Hartley Vale's diverse economy. What emerged was a color-coded diagram that documented the reality in 2022, what relationships had been kept in place, as well as what relationships needed to be reactivated or strengthened in the post-pandemic time. Taking Michelle's map as a guide, we convened a collaborative design workshop to explore making her aspirations a reality. Critical to the creative process we sought to initiate in the workshop was inviting the things that matter, as Verbeek and Corcoran put it. The 20 workshops participants were invited to bring to the workshop an artifact or a material that represented the circular economy to them. In introducing these objects during the first activity, participants were enacting a provocation through a performative thing power of materials, as Jane Bennett puts it, normally embedded within practice. A braid of garlic, a box of coffee grounds, a container of soil conditioner from the dehydrator, a drawing of a truck, a well-made fruit box, and so on were all placed in the center of the seated participants. These materials formed a kit of parts for the inventive activity to follow, acting as playful triggers, as Akama puts it, and loosening the hold of their current economic role while evoking alternative possibilities. They become a focal point for a conversation with people about how might we reimagine or redraw the economy. As Kalan and Kalaskin write, for a thing to be valued, it's necessary to have agencies capable of valuing them. In surfacing their matters of concern, we witnessed a serendipitous moment of marketization. One of the coffee roasters had brought with them a waste material called chaff. Chaff is a byproduct of coffee roasting and a fairly new material for many people in the circle. They said that they were looking for ways to reuse this substance, which was currently going directly to landfill. So if you felt it, it felt a little bit like wheat germ. That's sort of what it looked like. Immediately in the workshop, 3 hands shot up from other participants who had ideas for reuse. Unsurprisingly, it was the farmers, opening future market possibilities in the room. Here, the research process was momentarily transformed into a space of agent encounter and exchange, a generative form of mutuality that worked to extend our shared understanding of how markets work and what and how futures might be crafted. This was an example not of effective matchmaking, but rather the beginnings of a new social relationship. The ambitious and pragmatic aim of our workshop was to collaboratively invent a circular supply chain, gathering up the threads of existing but disarticulated efforts to support the creative, practical work of logistics, namely how these efforts might be knit together in a world that resists such improvisations. Michelle brought other farmers from the region with much larger acreages, up to 700 acres, inspired by her approach to regenerative farming, into this group effort to rethink what it would take to make this happen. Participants assembled around a 4-meter-long map designed to represent various points in a reverse logistics supply chain. How food waste is deposited, gathered and transported, dehydrated, transported again, and finally received onto farms for windrow composting. As participants discussed and mapped and worked together to think through the logistics of these ideas, this conversation became quite voluble. Breaking. Oh dear.
No, I couldn't hear.
How about now?
Yeah.
Sorry, folks, there's just a little bit of logistical difficulties. I'm not sure where we dropped off, but I was describing activity 2 in the workshop where we were imagining together what a reverse logistics supply chain might look like. And this was a really exciting moment in engaged research. This was one of those moments where you really had to corral and direct the conversation, or you realized that you were going to spend the rest of the day talking. So what was happening here for me was the invention of a nascent social alliance, reorienting social action into a new form of society. So transposing this reverse logistics diagram, Berard and Grand's figure for the plurality of the virtual, onto the diverse economies framework, we might begin to see 4 points where this reverse logistics supply chain might be enabled. So this, just to go through these 4 points, starting from the end point of the process. The first is the logic of the gift. So the family farms are in a position to receive tons of this waste, up to 20 tons per year, for windrow composting as a gift, meaning that they're not a commercial waste management facility and they're not going to charge tipping fees, right? So they can receive this waste for free. Social enterprises like Mates on the Move can haul this waste in a cost-effective way because their mission is employment and training and not profitability, right? So they're able to explore and enter into partnerships like this. They act as subcontractors for all the majors, but they've got some flexibility because of their normative commitments, their status as a social enterprise. UTS, in offering this food dehydrator into the system, they were quite self-interested and pragmatic here. They wanted to reduce the number of hauls of putrescible waste from their university cafes by 50%, which is something they were able to achieve by removing the moisture from this waste. But then that becomes a sort of nodal point in the system that can act as a point of storage and transfer. UTS shut down their food waste dehydrator during the pandemic. Now that they've opened it up again, they're actually in a position to accept food waste from other institutions. So they're negotiating with the Powerhouse Museum right now to get their food waste as well. There's no reason why other cafes couldn't also participate in this system. And I think sort of the final enabling point is the cafes and roasters and institutional purchasers who want to do the right thing and want to be seen to do the right thing with their environmental service governance commitments. And they can also be enrolled into this system, right? So we've got gifts, we've got the normative commitments of social enterprises, we've got large-scale institutional actors like UTS, and we've got a whole network of people potentially interested in this system. Those are enabling conditions arrayed in a diverse economy that might transform the way we deal with this one aspect of organic waste. So part of the story that emerges here is how different economic logics, gift, rational self-interest, employment creation, and environmental governance commitments can give rise to forms of social innovation. The workshop was instrumental in clarifying these existing and potential relationships in an exercise in thinking with the world. There is a next part to this story, which is that Abby and I are meeting on Friday with a subset of this group. And we've got two things on the agenda: exploring grant opportunities for purchasing an electric vehicle that we could then sub out to Mates on the Move to operationalize this system further, and trying to work up a pitch to get support from Tanya Plibersek. And there's a number of reasons why we think she might be receptive. So this is a to be continued story. Now, I realize in telling this story, there's sort of a so what factor here, which is, all right, this is one experiment, one initiative that's fairly small scale and at the proof of concept phase. On the other hand, Sydney produces 3,000 tons of spent coffee grounds per year, according to Planet Arc. And that's not an insignificant amount of organic waste to begin to think about, well, what could we do with it, right? And this is, as Michelle Zybots puts it, only one part of a larger effort to really rethink our custodial relationship with organic waste. The enabling context here is that organic waste constitutes about 50% of Sydney's waste stream, right? So about half. And Lord Mayor Clovermore said 2 years ago that in 7 years' time, which means we have 5 years left, she wants 80% of that waste diverted from landfill. So currently, organic waste is mostly heading out to Goulburn into a mine tailing to combine with other forms of waste and then ultimately become a source of carbon dioxide that adds to global warming. This is an effort at doing something else with it. It's not the only one, but it certainly could be a significant one. So Michelle, who isn't just a transport planner, but according to her genealogy is descended from a long line of Latvian generals, has a plan to think bigger. And her bigger plan is to imagine, well, what if we were to use this organic waste not just to grow heirloom varieties of garlic, but industrial hemp? So this is partly inspired by her partnership with James, who is one of the few builders in New South Wales who's conversant and working with industrial hempcrete as a building material. In another facet of this project, we encountered an architect who knew James quite well, and they had actually built buildings together. And if you want to see what hempcrete looks like, you can go out to Hartley Vale. Their big drying room is built using this material. And it can be rendered, but if it's left naked, you can actually see the kind of mixture of fibrous material and cement. It's really quite beautiful. Anyways, one of the reasons why we might get excited about hemp as a building material is that if it's on properly conditioned soil, it can sequester between 15 and 22 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare every year that it's grown, which means along with bamboo, it's the best carbon sink that we know of in terrestrial setting. So Michelle has gone further and said, well, if we actually put 6.4 million hectares of land under cultivation for hemp, we could actually sequester all the carbon that's produced annually in New South Wales. So there, pictured in blue and green, is the surface area that would be required. And you can see that it encompasses towns like Mudgee and Dubbo and Parks and Orange and Bathurst. Now, she's not proposing that all of that land suddenly gets given over to hemp cultivation, but when you look at sort of all the areas in New South Wales where we do broadacre farming, this could be part of the mix. Right now, most of the hemp that's being grown in Australia is being grown in Western Australia, but there's no reason why it couldn't be grown here and why it couldn't be a feedstock for a reconfigured construction industry. And again, it could work hand in glove with all the kinds of initiatives and experiments that are happening at Western Sydney University with some of our colleagues in the building and engineering areas of study. Right, so I think this gives us a much bigger vision of what the circular economy can be, which is that it's not just waste management. It's also a context for thinking about regional futures, about the future of small businesses and small farming. It's about opportunities for new forms of employment and social inclusion. It's a way of really, and in a deep way, responding to climate change, not just through adaptation, but through new forms of mitigation by working in partnership with the more than human world, right? So there's a lot to think about that comes from this one small example, right? And then we can leap from the small scale, 12 hectares, to a much bigger vision. But, and this is uncharacteristic for me, I usually like to give talks that just go in a optimistic or hopeful direction, but I do feel compelled to sound a kind of cautionary note. How am I doing for time? Got plenty of time. Okay. All right. Well, then I'll tell you the sad story, one that you're probably familiar with, which is the story of RedCycle. So this is one of the sister streams in our research project is looking at single-use plastics. And you might be familiar with the RedCycle bins that were in every major supermarket throughout New South Wales. RedCycle was a social enterprise that was started by two women who were really concerned with single-use plastics, and in particular, high-density polyethylene plastic bags because of the consequences they have primarily in oceans. And they wanted to do something about it. So they started RedCycle with the idea that, well, what if we were to become a supplier for remanufacture? RedCycle was a great idea, right? And so Woolworths and Coles said, well, gee, why don't you solve our PR problem, which is that we generate tons of this plastic bags. We can become a kind of private infrastructure that provides this alternative pathway for recycling. But here's where we run into the problem, right? So with the reforms in the latter half of the 2020s, we don't export HDPE anymore. And we have only limited capacity in this society for remanufacture. So Replas is probably the most famous business that takes plastic waste and turns it into plastic bollards and decking material. They only put about 10% of recycled material in their mix. Now, there are other businesses that do the same thing, but there's no way that the domestic remanufacture industry could possibly absorb all of this plastic waste. The other thought that they had was that in Tari, they were going to build a plant that would convert HDPE into some kind of a alternative fuel oil. Unfortunately, the techniques and the capital never materialized for that plant in Tari. And now we know the rest of the story, which is that we're all left holding the bag. The bag taking the shape of more than 500 million plastic bags located in Marsden and the outskirts of Sydney or down in Melbourne and elsewhere with no market and really as a giant sort of fire hazard, right? So I think part of what's already gone up in flames is a lot of the goodwill around what circularity might mean. I think it also reveals sort of the limits of conflating circular economy and recycling and really speaks to the need to, I think, do what Project Lead Gay Hawkins advocates, which is that we need to find more and more ways to break up with single-use plastic and just find an alternative way of bringing food to market. Plastic waste cannot be the skin of commerce. So yeah, I guess as I think about scaling up these solutions around organic waste, there's a note of caution here that needs to be internalized when we're thinking about what kinds of experiments to conduct and whether or not we want to scale out as opposed to scaling up. Another example, just because I can't resist it, we have a neighbor on the other side of the Rydalmere campus, on the other side of the river, Earth Power, which has been based in Camellia for the last 22 years. So Earth Power is a large-scale organic waste anaerobic digester. So they take in waste material from municipalities or from food and beverage industries and digest it and then generate methane gas, which they use to create electricity, right? That's the model. They were running successfully for a while. They ran into some kind of financial difficulties in the 2010s. So they got bought by Veolia and one of the other waste majors. But again, just like RedCycle, what happened was that they began taking all kinds of food waste, including packaged food waste from supermarkets. And the idea is you then have to unpackage the material, get rid of the plastic, and then put it in the digester. Very difficult to do. They ended up contaminating their digester, and basically it shut down, and now they're in all kinds of difficulties. And all of that food waste ended up going off to Goulburn. right? So there again, I think there's this issue around scale that we need to think about very carefully. And gosh, that's a depressing point to end, but that's sort of what I have to share with you. I am super excited to hear any questions. I think this idea of using spent coffee ground as a principal medium for really advancing the cause of regenerative farming is something I'm very interested in. It's an ongoing conversation, and I'd love for you all to be a part of it. Thanks very much for your attention.
I have a roving mic here to capture any questions in the room, and also Badger is monitoring the chat. So she will also let us know if there's any chat questions. Testing. Okay, up the back.
Firstly, thanks very much. That was great. And I was just going to say, do you think that the issues with the red cycle and the earth power examples that you gave are not just issues of scale, but issues of the products themselves, in that plastic cannot truly be circular because waste equals food is the pinnacle of what we should be looking to achieve. If you're looking at the streams of recycling the plastics, and there's always going to be toxins, there's always going to be, so if anything goes wrong, the potential for harm is great. If you spill coffee grounds, the harm, is, not there as such. And you also mentioned the more than human agents in that circular process. So the biosphere and the cooperative nature of humans were the models of success in those examples as much as the scale. So if we can't enlist the biosphere in this processes, are they truly circular at all?
Thank you.
Bless your heart. That was a perfect question, and I really appreciate it. I guess I really wish my colleague Gay Hawkins were here. Unfortunately, she's on an interview panel for some job or other right now, because she could really speak, I think, in much greater depth than I can to the plastics issue. That's been sort of a vital part of her research for the last 20 years. But I will say a few things. I think for me, part of the story here is well-intentioned social enterprise meets the logics of profit-driven merchant capitalist enterprises that want to look good, right? And that just, it wasn't a good match, right? I think you've also mentioned the sort of the irredeemable nature of the material. So I think, to kind of paraphrase Gay, and probably not to do justice to her arguments, there's a place for plastics, which is when you want to build something that's durable, right? But single use, yeah, it's one of those things where I think we need to look seriously about what it would take to rearrange the logistics about how we get food to market that doesn't involve so much of it, which means rethinking how we think about health and safety and food handling and so forth. There are ways of doing it, though, and I think that's another space for social innovation. The alternative would be bioplastics, right? And there's a lot of exploration around that. And I can see somebody shaking their head, and here's why, right? I just went to an international conference that brought together academics and practitioners who are concerned with waste, and organic bioplastics came up in that context. And one of the problems is that their synthesis involves a lot more chemicals, and when they break down, they become attractors for ambient toxicity, right? So in the end, they're a false solution. I mean, I'm just going to be blunt. I don't think that's the direction that we should be heading in. And you're right, on some level, the example I've picked is one that really invites circular thinking, cooperation, and alignment of normative intents, and alignment of the relationship between human communities and more than human communities. One might say it's a kind of, it's a wisdom through the ages, right? And I think we could go further and say, well, what about the organic waste that comes from human beings themselves? So UTS has also been experimenting with urine diversion and collecting the phosphorus from human urine as a way of enriching soil. Why? Because Australian soils are phosphorus depleted, right? So this is, I think these are questions that are front and center. especially in a society like ours at the end of a supply chain. If we look at broadacre farming here, right, they're dependent on fertilizers that come from abroad. And where does nitrate fertilizer come from? Oh yeah, it's a byproduct of natural gas, right? It's that synthesis process. What's wrong with natural gas markets at the moment? Oh, I forgot, major geopolitical strife. And we're at the beginning of that story, not the end, right? So in a sense, like reinventing how we think about fertilizer and food security, that's a whole other area that we can get into via thinking in circular terms. But for me, it means broadening what that conversation means and what that idea means beyond just, virtue signaling. I'll be that blunt about it. Thank you for the question.
We've got some questions online as well. Badra, would you like to read those out? I'll give you the mic.
There is a question from Clinton Rakish. Are there any non-environmental or soil health issues with broad-scale industrial hemp plantings, or 100% good to go?
Good question. I wish James were here. I would defer to my colleagues at HEI, at the Hawkesbury Environmental Institute for that question. I guess from what I have read and understood, it is a crop that's pretty easy to grow. It is one of those crops that generates a lot of roots, which is why it's so good for soil sequestration. My suspicion is that we would have to look very carefully at all those things as attendant matters of concern. One thing I will say, though, sort of that moment of diversion where I changed it to the question I actually want to answer, is that with spent coffee grounds in particular, they're easy to dry. They've got that sort of that interesting chemistry that makes them both repulsive and attractive, and as they turn into soil. But one thing they don't have is they don't have weed seeds. They don't have pathogens. So a lot of the things that would suggest that we should just buy conditioned soil from large-scale composting operations don't really apply here, right? So when we think in more individual or specific terms about what kind of organic waste could be enrolled into organic regenerative farming, there's some real advantages to thinking about this particular food waste stream. And, so then once you've got an amended soil, I guess to circle back to your question, any crop is going to take nutrients out of the soil and be a problem over time, which is why on some level, regenerative farming really is about tending to the soil on an ongoing basis, in the same way that, like, if you buy a house, you buy all of its problems for the remainder of your life.
There are a few raised hands as well as questions.
Oh.
Ian has asked a question and he has raised his hand. So Ian, you want to unmute and talk?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the presentation. It's really interesting. I'm a town planner. I'm actually a PhD candidate looking at the impact of development on the vegetable production in Western Sydney. And one of the things that I've done is look at the land use of Western Sydney. And Western Sydney's land use is actually mostly rural residential people not that aren't farming but have large blocks of land. And there's a potential to reuse some of these coffee grounds on their land. They're basically growing horses or growing other things or vegetables and stuff. So there's a potential there that you don't necessarily have to transport it a long way. So is that something that could be looked at, I suppose I'm trying to say?
Yeah, definitely. And I think in that conversation that I alluded to, there were other farmers present, including those that were operating on this side of the Blue Mountains, some of whom were involved in what do you call it? Myoculture, mushroom agriculture, and vermiculture. Coffee grounds are a great substrate for that, especially when they're mixed with sawdust. As a kind of soil conditioner for whatever land that's just growing grass, absolutely. That's another possibility. And, with 3,000 tons per year to play with, I mean, after all, we are in the country that has brought coffee culture to its absolute apogee, we're probably, there's an abundance of opportunities for thinking about what to do with this resource.
And lastly, was John Fairley involved in this research? He's a dairy farmer from down at Picton, and he's been taking coffee grounds for a while now.
No, I haven't. If you've got his details, I'd love to reach out to him. I love dairy farmers.
Yeah, certainly.
And
he was doing it about 5 years ago, taking them from a restaurant in Bondi.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that kind of reminds me of another point, which is the proprietor of Camden Worms came to our workshop, and one of the things that she said was that coffee grounds as a medium for thinking in circular terms is a great way of enrolling the amateur, like someone who loves the craft. That it's a material that has multiple uses and that really, we can experiment with. And it's an experiment that everyone can participate in, including backyard farmers, including myself.
Thank you.
So all comers, everybody's welcome. Big circle, that's what we need.
Next, there is Beck. She has raised her hand too. Over to you, Beck.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. It was a fantastic talk. It was good to listen to you. My question is, I am the founder and the manager of a local not-for-profit social enterprise, and we collect, recycle and remanufacture scrap plastic. And I'm interested to hear that when you were conducting your interviews, was there much talk around I suppose, who is responsible to pay? Meaning, I'm only assuming from my own personal experience, the cost associated with sales, marketing, staff, insurances, land costs, water costs, electricity costs, transport costs, all that sort of stuff. Social enterprises need to make money. And I heard you talk about, what's next and growth. We need to make money to grow and expand. Was there much feedback on, or thought around who was responsible to actually pay?
Yeah. Look, I think that's a great question, and thanks very much for asking it. One of the things that I really appreciated about this workshop was that oftentimes when you have these kinds of conversations, that question about money or the bottom line or the profit motive really serves to derail the imagination and end the conversation even before it begins, which is, these are just the pragmatic realities. So what was really impressive was we were able to sustain the conversation around, well, what could we actually do for an entire day? And then that I think turns into a different context for thinking about, well, what would be needed in order to make this viable in economic terms. So one of the thoughts that we've been exploring is, what if a consortium of farmers actually bought the trucking infrastructure that would be required to make this possible? They could subcontract with Mates on the Move or maybe a set of social enterprises to do the hauling, and then they provide contract services for the hauling of organic waste, and that's what would pay for the people that are involved in trucking it. So that leaves unanswered questions about risk, about insurances and so forth. But, whatever, those are problems to be solved. And certainly social enterprises are spaces that bring together normative commitments and financial concerns. So we've got a global wealth of experience to draw on. And I'm only thinking of this because we have a world expert on social enterprises here in the audience today, who's thinking about those same issues in a majority world context, in the global South context. And they're solvable problems. I would go further and say the UN this year in March issued a proclamation that identified the central role of co-ops and social enterprises in realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, they went further and said, without that sector and without firms that have normative commitments in the foreground, we're not going to achieve them, right? So I think the question that you're asking is actually one that needs to find particular answers in all kinds of contexts.
There are 5 more questions in chat, but I'll go to the in person now before
Very good.
getting chat.
Thanks, Stephen. That was a wonderful talk. It's nice to hear again about the ground coffee and the reverse logistics supply chain. And actually, the question I was going to ask follows on from Beck in some ways, or it's related. I'm thinking about the framing of diverse economies and, you know, your diverse markets, diverse wage, diverse enterprise, and in particular the last column, financial. And I hadn't heard before actually the term diverse economizations, so the makings of markets, and it made me think that, you know, markets could almost be a kind of positioned in some ways as a kind of meta category with other things coming underneath it. But I would also wonder what you would think about diverse financialization. And the reason I asked that is because from my experience in Cambodia and what I'm seeing is that financialization of agrarian landscapes is driving climate change in a number of ways, because farmers are indebted before they start farming increasingly. So they adopt increasingly mechanized and chemical intensive practices. They lose food security in the process. And only by doing finance differently and financializing landscapes differently can we, I think, institute regenerative farming practices which are not intensive and environmentally damaging. So I'm wondering if there's a provocation here to think about financialization beyond just finance and money, because there's so much talk about impact investing where you go away from screening, like we don't invest tobacco, we don't invest alcohol, to actually investing in things that do good in the world. But that is a very narrow, I think, focus of attention. And if we think about finance very differently in terms of who pays, as Becca is asking, and also what kind of resources are involved, both financial and non-financial, that could be considered the financialization of coffee, the coffee ground value chain nonetheless. So that's my comment, really. It's just a provocation as to whether the finance category in the diverse economies framework can be extended more.
That was more than a question and a comment. That was like a little mini exegesis. And I noticed in the chat that someone was saying, well, what do you mean by financialization? So I'll have a crack at answering that question first, which is like, when we think in a majority world context about where farming is happening, it's mostly smallholders and mostly women, right? And historically, they haven't been able to get access to credit. So like the contemporary meaning of financialization is extending capital to people who don't have credit history. So you use proxy scores and you know, and there's all kinds of innovation happening there, like including using mobile phones and data transfer in order to sort of make money accessible to farmers. But as you said, the perverse flip side of that is it's a new form of indebtedness, right? So it's another form of pay later. And if that's all of our imagination of what finance is, then yeah, in a way, we're destined to reproduce more of the same. Let's say, on the other hand, imagine for a moment there's a resource-rich country that says, oh, well, actually, this is all part of a commonwealth. Maybe as we generate that wealth from extracting it, we should start a sovereign wealth fund and use it to kind of underwrite the society that we want. Climate reparation, land justice, justice for First Nations, right? Like all of that stuff could happen, or enabling small farmers and cafe owners to behave differently, right? That's what Norway has done over the last 50 years with their sovereign wealth fund because of oil wealth. Why couldn't Australia do the same, right? Like, so that would be a different form of financialization that would produce a different destiny, right? And of course, as you were also saying, there's all kinds of non-monetary investments, sweat equity and the like, through which we labor to produce a common world. So for instance, acting as a kind of political alliance of farmers and small business owners who want to see a different form of circularity. That's forming a political constituency that invests in a different future. And I have every reason to believe that someone like Tanya Plibersek would be very receptive to that, because she's really interested in both long-term environmental issues and, in particular, the reintegration of people in the society who've been through the judicial system. And there's a backstory to that, but I think this is there's sort of a moment here that we could explore together. So yeah, I think, look, the big story that's emerging in the world of finance is peer-to-peer lending and all kinds of innovations. It's just a question of like, what's the direction that we want to go in with all that innovation, all that sort of computer-assisted, digitally facilitated finance? Well, it means clarifying our values. As our colleague, the late David Graeber, said, with values, we make worlds, right? So if we get clear on what is worthy of our work, then we do better work. And again, I think we're at an institution that really says that's our mandate. Seems like a... Sorry, I'll step off my soapbox now. There we go. I'm back on the ground.
A question from Marion. Is there any studies on the impact of bioplastics in soil?
Yes, there are, and they were referred to at this conference that I attended called Open the Bin 3, which is sort of the brainchild of the Discard Studies group of scholars. So that was an ongoing and live conversation that brought together practitioners and academics from all over the world thinking about waste. With a little bit of work, I could get you said references. Because all the papers from that particular conference were published ahead of time, which is a nice feature when we get together and really think deeply about an issue. It's a privilege in this context.
I'll just mention that if anyone wants to extend their contact details of interested parties, feel free to pop them in the chat. And we've got another question in the room.
Thank you, Stephen. Love the story about connecting the dots across an enormous space of our landscapes and those questions of scale. One of the things I think is an optimistic possibility with scaling up is all of our organisations now are aligning with high targets, net zero plans, local governments, corporates, utilities, universities, and then the pressure is on to deliver. And within that social licence, that means all those organisations have to work outside of their normal business as usual methods. It's interesting for Red Cycle that I saw in one of the media things afterwards was that Coles or Woolies were saying, well, we will revisit this. We'll pick it up. So they saw a social licence and responsibility to assist in some way. I don't know what they're going to do yet, but it just does show that alignment so that the social connectedness at a smaller scale hopefully soon will be supported by larger organisational initiatives.
Yeah. I mean, look, my colleague who asked the question there, Beck Healy, I don't know, share a last name. Oh yeah, that's because we're married. She studied the Red Cycle story in depth. And I think one of the things that's really impressed me about Australia as a kind of social and cultural context was that people understood that it wasn't their failing. It was a collective failing of imagination around how should we make this work? And we needed to disburden them of the custodial responsibility for that material, right? That's something that collectively we have to shoulder. So I've been impressed with that. And I'm not saying that things weren't done wrong in that context, but certainly it is an opportunity for us to really learn about how do we leap from the small scale experiment to something that's big, that reconfigures our social relationships with material and one another? Well, I think it's worth remembering that this conversation is only 2 generations old. Like before that, we didn't really think about custodianship with waste materials. It's really about 1970 when this conversation began. So we're still learning as a global community. And I think there's a lot of opportunity, but the question is for whom? And so that, for me, the mission is to constantly inject that question, cui bono, like who benefits from this? I have lots of other colleagues who are doing that, including my student and collaborator, Douglas Belton, who's really trying to think about, can we involve people who are refugees or from BIPOC communities in the practice of regenerative farming? And again, that sort of broadens the circle broadens what circular economy means so that it intersects with issues of social justice, both in this country and in the US that he's native to, like myself. Yeah. Great question. Lots of room to riff on it.
There are a lot of questions and conversations happening. So really you have
good.
generated some great interest. So the next one is from Connor Smith. Do you think we need to wait for government mandates before system like coffee grounds to farm can be turned successful, truly successful?
Yeah, look, I'm going to give the super American answer and say, no, we don't have to wait for government and we don't have to ask anybody's permission. This is a material, as I said, that the amateur loves. We can experiment with this. And then we can actually just draw local government into the conversation. And there were people from throughout the inner West who were in attendance at this workshop and who are interested in continuing to have this conversation. I know them by name, so I'm going to keep counting on them. And again, like if anybody that's listening wants to connect in relation to this project, you can get my email address on the website for uni.
They're sharing their email address and all sort of things for further communication.
Awesome.
Yeah, but
That's so
there is
good.
one from Fiona, Melbourne, representing Reground, a social enterprise that started Australia's first that we are aware of, and the largest ground coffee recycling community, and has been collecting and recycling coffee grounds and chaff locally for almost a decade. My question is, how can those of us already working in this space find new ways to collaborate, share our learnings, and increase our impact?
Yes. So this is one of those embarrassing moments where I'm glad to make your acquaintance. I was unaware of that, but I think this is why, like if I look at where circular economy comes from as a concept, it really came from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and then gets plunked down into the Australian context in this sort of, there's this exogenous model. Let's see what we can do with it, right? And it kind of forecloses on that, using research to create conversational spaces where we can see what's already going on. That's what I mean when I say we need to take a diverse approach. Like the operating assumption of this project is there are already people out there doing the good work, and research becomes a context for making their acquaintance and learning together. So, I don't have any good answers, but what I can say is certainly we're in touch now. I'd love to know more about what's going on in Melbourne. I think there's a lot that can be learned in New South Wales from Victoria across a number of areas. So, yeah, I think at least for research, the partnership model, there's a whole sort of scheme that the Australian government advances, the linkage project, where we can partner with community groups and industry more broadly to try and explore what's possible. So let's be in touch and have a chat.
And Audrey, and there is a conversation between Audrey and others, how small businesses such as cafes based in the eastern suburbs of Sydney can donate their used coffee ground to be used in rural farming. So people are answering a few things.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yeah, well, that's right. Because I think the supply chain that we described was connecting particular farms, institutions, and cafes and roasters. There's no reason why the model couldn't be replicated. And of course, again, there are other uses for spent coffee grounds, just that one waste stream. And some of them are really exotic. Like I know Venus Schwala and UNSW is saying, well, could we actually use coffee grounds as an alternative coking agent for steel production? That could be done. In fact, it is being done. But I guess for me, it's, there's something right and just about saying actually returning it to the soil is really important. And looking after that, coming to ground, caring for country, like all that stuff that we hear, we need to make it so.
And they said some of them love to hear your studies and get some more information.
Yeah.
And they have shared their details.
Yeah, well, for me, all scholarship is slow scholarship. We are publishing, so we've got an article out in Journal of Cultural Economy that describes this story again in a little bit more detail. But we're coming to the end of this particular project, so the publication outputs and infographics hopefully will be forthcoming, but I don't know, can only work so fast.
We were thinking of putting together a bit of a mailing list for people who have attended thought leadership events that sort of are interested in additional information or updates. So if you're interested in joining the mailing list, just indicate that in the chat. We'll save the chat transcripts and we can sort of keep you updated with links and things.
Just to echo Badra's remark there, thank you so much for those super illuminating questions, both online and in person. I love the Q&A part. It's the best part.
And they say, love what you do. So a lot of appreciation, Stephen.
Yeah, very good. Very good.
Okay, I think that wraps up our session for today. Thank you everyone who joined. Thank you for your questions online and most of all, thank you, Stephen, for talking today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.